Well, time has passed. David's conscience has been simmering, I suppose, we could probably assume. Nathan probably knew the story. He was an insider, and this is not the kind of thing you keep secret. And so he probably knew something of what had happened, but nevertheless, he didn't precipitously go and confront David until, by some means or other, God had given Nathan the prompt to do so. I think it probably took a little courage on Nathan's part. You don't go with kind of a indifferent attitude to the king to call him on the carpet like this. Nathan didn't know that David's response was going to be something like, I've sinned against the Lord, as opposed to off with his head or something like that, Kings can do that sometimes. And so at this point, Nathan, following the counsel of David's son Solomon, embraced the proposition, the righteous are as bold as a lion, and went to confront David and told him a story. This is a case, actually. David is the chief judicial officer in Israel. It's his job to render judicial opinions and to pronounce sentences and give verdicts. And so, under the rubric, as it were, of a case, Nathan comes and presents a story for which David is expected to render an opinion. Well, the story involves a rich man who had a whole lot and a poor man who had very little. And of course, the rich man didn't want to take from his own wealth. He takes this one little lamb, slaughters it, serves it, even though it was like a daughter to the poor man. David would immediately identify with the story. He had been a shepherd. He knew the affection that can be developed with these little creatures that can be so dependent and just a little bit stupid, actually. And so they need oversight, they need help, and David was certainly one with whom that story would resonate. Lambs were often in the capacity of pets. They didn't have dogs as pets because dogs were regarded as unclean. In the Old Testament, we never once hear dogs referred to in a positive sense. They're always scavengers. They're always those kind of animals that are sort of on the outside. And so in this case, we're not surprised to hear that it was a lamb that was this household pet that happens to be the subject of this story. So here comes a traveler to this rich man. He has served the little lamb that was the next door neighbor's, took that lamb, served it up. The traveler that came, who's mentioned here, is described by three different phrases, which are actually rather distinct, especially as I understand it in the original Hebrew language. Each one has a little kind of nuance to it. There have been attempts occasionally to find sort of symbolic meanings. This is not very smart when it comes to Bible interpretation to start trying to find allegorical meanings, but I thought this one was interesting. It was actually pitched by a rabbi named Rabbi Rashi, who said he thought the three descriptions of this traveling man actually represented three ways of thinking about covetousness, which happened to be the crime for which David had gotten himself in trouble with Bathsheba. And so he thought maybe this traveling man was giving us a little insight. The story starts with this fellow that shows up as a mere passerby, kind of traveling down the road. You don't have any particular connection to him. There he goes. But he becomes then one who is a so-called wayfaring man. Now the sense of that would be someone who stops in routinely, doesn't live with you, but may drop by every week, every other week. He has a little place he can stay, more of a semi-permanent kind of arrangement, until finally he becomes one who comes, which suggests someone who's living in your house basically on a permanent basis. And the rabbi was suggesting that that's kind of the way covetousness is, lust. We can't help going through life and occasionally confronting the vision of things that are off limits, desirable, but we know we shouldn't go there. And so we just turn away, walk away, forget it, reject it. But if we entertain it for a little while, then that little hint of lust can take up some kind of residence and become more of a long-term companion in our lives. Martin Luther said you can't help it if a bird will fly over your head, but you can keep it from making a nest in your hair, you know. There is a sense in which we have to be on our guard. We can't help occasionally running into those images that are seductive. It happens to all of us. But we can do something about where we go next. And so the rabbi was suggesting that that's the very thing David had not done. He had probably already entertained little thoughts about Bathsheba, not really repudiating them. And finally, when the opportunity presents itself, he didn't have what it took to resist the temptation. So for whatever you think it's worth, you know, there it is. I'm not sure that that was intended by the original author, but it does give us one of those interesting little kind of colorable treatments of it. Anyway, the fellow took the poor man's lamb. It's a powerful parable. It's tough to write a good parable. I used to teach hermeneutics, and when we would cover parables, the rules that are supposed to be applied to the proper interpretation of a parable, before we dive into it, I'd always give the assignment, go home and write a parable. Seems like it ought to be pretty easy, you know. Kids would come back the next day, start reading. We began to realize after a while it ain't as easy as it looks to write a really good parable. It has to be drawn from real life. It can't be fanciful. It has to have one objective and sort of lead you to that objective in a way that almost like bait draws you to its conclusion and then traps you in it, you know. Especially parables like this one. These were the kind that Jesus would sometimes tell, especially during Holy Week, baiting the trap for the corrupt religious leaders in Jerusalem, leading them down the path to where they really condemn themselves in the way that they respond to the parable being told. And so this parable really fits the bill, stirs the emotion, it hit David's heart, it had the intended effect, and as a result of that, of course, David's emotions are aroused. Greatly aroused, we hear, against this fictitious man, though David doesn't know that. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, he says. He shall restore fourfold for the lamb because he has done this thing and has had no pity. I read from two different translations to kind of give you a flavor. The earlier one, you notice, the New Revised Standard said he deserves to die. This one says he shall surely die. The Hebrew doesn't say either one. What it says is he is a son of death, which is a Hebraic kind of expression that really embraces both ideas. To be a son of death means that what you've done in life means that you should surely die for what you've done. You deserve to die. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a sentence of death, but it comes very close to it. So it's a powerful phrase, and that's exactly what David uses now to describe this man, the conduct of which has aroused him so deeply. What David gives at this point when he says, he shall surely die, is not a judicial opinion. It's not saying go out, find the guy and hang him, tomorrow morning or something. But it is his gut reaction. It's how angry he is at the story that he's been told. One commentator said, it's surprisingly easy to develop a head of steam over injustice inflicted on others, while remaining blind to the injustice I myself might be inflicting. There's always a warning to those who argue for better treatment of others to, quote, practice what you preach, to look for the beam in my own eye. Sigmund Freud made famous in one of his so-called defense mechanisms something called projection. You all know that, don't you? I have bad attitudes, and I immediately project them on the people I see and assume they have all those same bad attitudes. I'm really interpreting life through the filter of my own strange view of the universe, and I assume everybody else is laboring under the same weight. And that may be something of what happened with David. His reaction was certainly legitimate, and yet it may have even been an overreaction because he had something in his own psyche that suggested to him that he was guilty of the same thing, though he didn't quite recognize it was a story really about him. What he actually renders as an opinion here, a verdict, is exactly what Moses commanded. In the law of Moses, when the commandment, thou shalt not steal, is being construed. Various examples, so-called casuistry, case law is provided, giving examples of how it should be applied. And one of the examples is, if a man steals a sheep, then he needs to pay it back fourfold. So David doesn't go beyond what the law of Moses required, even though he wanted to, And so at this point, he gives that verdict of a fourfold reparation. Interestingly, what happens in David's career is that God exacts from David that same fourfold reparation, as we'll see in just a moment. David snaps the trap. I'm sorry, not David. Nathan snaps the trap. Sorry. Thou art the man. You're the man. Usually when we say that to each other, we mean it as a compliment. Wow, you're the man. Slap on the back. This was not quite that. David, you're the man. So it shows the power of a well-told parable. We mentioned earlier Jesus did this. If you read the parables he told during Holy Week, you see the same kind of thing going on. Nathan, in a sense, here is giving voice, I suppose you would say, to the conscience of David. David has been repressing that voice, trying to keep it from annoying him in his day-to-day conduct as the king of Israel. And now that voice comes through loud and clear through the mouth of Nathan. And Nathan tells David, you're the one who's stolen that sheep. He adds, I anointed you, speaking for God, king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. The whole point here is that what David had done was not only a great reproach and embarrassment to David, but it was a reproach to God. Because whenever we act as a Christian person, or in any capacity that represents some kind of representative of God and his actions in this world, then our misdeeds bounce back, as it were, and become a reproach to God himself. That's why it's always a great tragedy when people in conspicuous Christian leadership trip up. And we, of course, feel the pain of that, because it not only represents something in the fault of that person, but it has those broader repercussions as well, as it certainly did in the case of David. Nathan says, I gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have given you much more. It was customary in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, when a king took over, pushed out a preceding king, he could take over all the rights and privileges, possessions, including the harem, all of that, to the extent that, we don't know exactly the details of what happened in this case, but nevertheless, that in principle was what occurred, that David basically took over the house of Saul. God gave him a balance between these two rather competitive factions in Israel. Judah on the one hand, the other tribes on the other, and yet somehow a semblance of unity had been given. And then this breathtaking additional comment, I would have given you much more, you just had to ask. It makes you wonder, how much do we lose ourselves for not just trusting God? How much do we jockey for, better position in life when we should just be trusting God? David, of course, fell into that little trap himself. Nathan continues, why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You've killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You've taken his wife to be your wife. You've killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you've despised me. You've taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. When Uriah died out there during that siege at Ammon, Joab sent him a message, you know that from last week or 2 weeks ago. Joab said, Uriah the Hittite is dead. And David waxed philosophical, you remember? Well, Joab, don't worry about it. Don't take it to heart. I mean, for goodness sakes, the sword devours one as well as another. It's those lousy swords out there. How are we going to get control on those swords? And all the violence they're committing? Swords are just everywhere. You know, that was the problem. And David, of course, is hoping, in a sense, to deflect blame not only for Joab's sake, but for his own, hoping he can hide behind secondary causes, distance himself from the instruments of violence by making it the sword's fault. And so the irony is, of course, the sword is going to unleash some of its violence in David's own house. If it does indeed, consume one after the other, David, brace yourself. And he's going to face the very fourfold restitution that he had announced was deserved by a man who had stolen a sheep. Only in the case of David, the fourfold payment was going to be vastly more painful. It would begin with the death of the son born to Bathsheba. It would be followed by the death of Amnon. Probably the incident involving Amnon and Tamar, which we're going to look at next week, had already happened. He had already violated her, but there'd been no punishment, there'd been no consequence. That's going to come later, in which Amnon is going to die at the hands of the brother of Tamar, whose name was Absalom. But then, as it turns out, Absalom, the third of these sons of David, would die himself at the hands of Joab. And then, if that weren't enough, reaching the very end of the line, the end of David's life, when he's on his deathbed, we have the fourth of these, in which Adonijah, the oldest surviving son of David, jockeys for the throne, contrary to David's direction that Solomon would succeed, and Adonijah himself winds up a dead man as well by the time it's all over. So a fourfold restitution that David himself had announced is going to be the restitution that he will in fact pay. That particular aspect of the story has been noted many times by many commentators, one of whom said, in a kind of poetic justice, the fourfold punishment is inflicted on David in the death of Bathsheba's firstborn, Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah. The consequences of David's sin reminds us that all sin is serious precisely because we are creatures of great dignity. The fall of a great person arouses more notice in the press, and in some deep sense, we are all great people. We notice it more with people like David. We notice it with people in high public office. We notice it with folks who have some kind of visibility in the public square, but in some ways all of us have that kind of greatness about us, and that makes our misdeeds great misdeeds, which must, by the nature of the case, produce great consequences. And so even though David is a conspicuous example of this, we learn from his example what really applies to all of us. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this son, referring, of course, to what Absalom did. When David fled from Jerusalem, Absalom publicly, in a way that was visible to the people who could see it, went into the concubines of David. There was a tent set up on the house of David. It was a great reproach to David, a great insult. It made Absalom's coup irreversible. Absalom did that on the advice of Ahithophel, who happened to be the grandfather of Bathsheba. And you can imagine that Ahithophel himself was trying to, in a sense, strike back in the same kind of gruesome way against David, in the way that David, he felt, had defiled and insulted his granddaughter Bathsheba. And it made that coup by Absalom irretrievable. It made the entire event bigger than it had been in the first place. One said the sins that followed exceeded the original. As is often the case, a stream becomes a river. Nathan concludes his indictment of David with the following: "You did it in secret, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun." So, as commentators commonly note here, sin will always have this kind of private aspect. It's a rift with God. It can be deeply personal, can be deeply private, indeed secret. But inevitably there's always a rift with others, which is very often much more visible, much less private. And in fact, both of them are necessarily part of what happens when we violate God's laws for us. God has wired the universe such that God is not mocked. What a man sows, he reaps. And though we can find forgiveness through repentance, and God does lavish mercy upon us, it doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that the consequences go away. You all know that. You're all big boys and girls, aren't you? We've seen this again and again in our own lives and in the lives of others, that God can forgive and does forgive, but it doesn't give you a get-out-of-jail-free card. You know, there is still that necessary consequence, and David had to, of course, live with that now for years to come. David, I wonder what the expression was on his face as Nathan gave him this short speech. I wonder how long was the pause when he sat there in silence with that message thundering into his conscience. But what he says is very much to the point. I've sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, "Now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die." So the heart of the matter, David has sinned. He acknowledges it. And at least at that point, we see the David that we have known and loved finally coming back into the picture. Psalm 51, of course, is the great poetic expression of what David says here in just a few words. "Against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight." That is the heart of the matter when it comes to our disobedience. It's sin against God, and in so doing, it becomes injurious to everybody else, you know. One commentator said, our sin is always sin against God. Sin is an assault against God's sovereign rule in that, one, as a child of God, it represents disobedience. Two, as a representative of God, it dishonors the King for whom we are all ambassadors. Three, as a member of a community, it's an attack on other members of the same community. And you see kind of the broad waterfront of this whole thing. We violate this fellowship we have with God. Those who look at us and see us as representatives of the Christian movement, for example, see something that they immediately interpret and apply to the God that we claim to represent. And in our own community with each other, the injury of this, of course, is unavoidable. Nathan says to David that God has put away his sin. Now, the reason for that is because what David did was a capital offense. And strictly speaking, David, who had claimed that a man who stole a sheep was a son of death, was vastly more a son of death, deserving to die, exposing himself to that particular consequence for his actions. He might have been forced at this point to abdicate the throne. He could actually have been tried for the crimes he had committed, and worst case, he could have been executed for them. Given what actually happened in his life, David might have preferred that. But the fact of the matter is, God's put away that, so that particular consequence is not going to take place. But again, as we were saying, it doesn't mean that there will be no consequence, because what David did had given great occasion to the enemies of God to scoff, to mock, to blaspheme. The enemies here presumably are not the surrounding nations, by the way, who would certainly know about this and probably be a little bemused by it. But the fact of the matter is, what David had done, judged by their ethical standards, was not much more than a little peccadillo. It didn't amount to much. This kind of thing was commonly done among the pagans. But David, of course, held himself conspicuously and publicly to a much higher standard. But the enemies that apparently are in view here are the unbelieving people in Israel who have their eyes on David. And as soon as David messes up like this, they can just, I knew it. This guy's supposed to be such a hot, godly, big deal, virtuous. Look at this. And it becomes an excuse to say this whole thing is a charade. The man's a hypocrite. Look at this. And that, of course, becomes a wonderful excuse for me to pursue my own life of disregard of what otherwise should be the obligations of my life. And so, in order to prevent that from happening, it was essential that there be public, visible, well-known consequences so that those who would be inclined to mock and scoff and be dismissive are forced to step back and recognize, sure enough, God is not mocked. And even a David is going to be paying the piper, you see. That's the way God has wired the universe. And that, of course, is something we've all seen many times in our own lifetimes, in the case of people in public position and elsewhere. This is the way God has put the universe together. There is a principle of righteousness at the heart of it that is as certain as the principle of gravity. Now, you can jump off a roof and defy the law of gravity for a while. And I can jump off the moral roof and defy God's law for a while. But God has built that righteous rule in just as surely as He's built gravity into it. And so the lesson here is one that I think we could predict just from what we know about the way life has to be. The occasion to blaspheme that's mentioned here reminds us of what we've all seen, of course, how quickly the press seizes on some flaw in the character of Christians in the public eye. It adds fuel to the claim that the church is filled with hypocrites. You got that right. I'm first in line, by the way, in case you were wondering. The world is always looking for an excuse to blaspheme and finds the excuse easily enough. We should, as Christians, turn the attention to Christ Himself. His life was flawless, regardless of how closely scrutinized, but the Apostle John says, quote, "Then the high priest questioned Jesus about His disciples." There's the rub, he concludes. It's the disciples of Jesus that are the problem. And that includes some of us in this room, I suspect, right? But anyway, that's the reason. That's the reason these things have to play out this way, is because that's the way God has established a principle of vindicating truth and righteousness among us. Well, Nathan went home. Soon enough, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David. It became ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child and fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. God struck the child. The Bible is unapologetic. This wasn't just, he didn't get his inoculations. This was God struck the child because we are responsible and because God is sovereign. The question, of course, always rises, well, what did the kid do, for Pete's sake? He's an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of this. And that is certainly a legitimate question to raise, to which one commentator responded, well, what of all the innocent children who have been damaged by the misdeeds of their parents. Isn't that the story? I mean, every one of us in this room who's a parent or grandparent knows the truth of that. That when we do things that are less than the call of Christ in our lives, there are repercussions, and our kids oftentimes pay the price. And it wasn't their fault, but the fact of the matter is often the sins of the fathers are visited to the third and fourth generations. And so we need to think about that. We don't live in a bubble. We don't live by ourselves. Our behavior affects those around us. And David learned it in a rather dramatic way. Well, David went in, not into the temple. The idea is went into some kind of private room, maybe a chapel in his own home or something like that, prostrates himself, fasting, pleading, grieving, of course, for a sick child who he anticipates will likely die in the next few days, grieving for the mother, Bathsheba, and the grief that obviously she's going through, his own sense of loss, and especially, of course, the sin that he'd committed that was the cause of all of this. It's also important to note that he's doing this because it was that the people should know that he was repentant. He is actually taking the role of a condemned man, pleading for mercy, only in this case pleading for it on behalf of the stricken child. The elders in the house didn't quite know what to make of it. The servants in the house, seeing this, arose and went to him to raise him up from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. Then on the seventh day it came to pass that the child died. The servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. They said, "Wow, when the child was alive and we spoke to him, he wouldn't heed our voice. How can we tell him the child is dead? He may do some harm," meaning harm to himself. When David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He's dead." So David had fasted. He'd been pleading for a week that God would extend mercy. I have to say it's astonishing to me how David did this in a way that was intended to be known. He's humbling himself in a way that's supposed to be recognized publicly, and he's doing it over the death or the prospective death of one child. There have been times in church history when God's people have done something like that they have gone into times of mourning, fasting, praying, pleading with God for the sins of the culture in which they reside. We don't see a whole lot of that in our culture. If you don't mind me pointing out, we're losing about 3,000 unborn children a day in this country. We probably should be doing a little bit less politicking, a little bit more praying and fasting and weeping so that it is seen publicly the grief that we feel over that great crime. Well, David did it. The servants of David, seeing the grief he was in, thought his grief was simply over the prospect of losing the child, and their fear was if the child died, he would be plunged into an even greater morose and depression and despondency, and even possibly become self-destructive. That's what they thought the trajectory of this train was, And so they're fearful for David, because when they know that the child is dead, they just don't know what to expect next. And that's why they were trying to keep the news from him, at least for a time, to figure out what to do. But of course, David's response is quite surprising to them. He is grief-struck. He's pleading for the child's life, going through all of this anguish for a week, and as soon as he hears that the child is dead, it's a new form of worship that he embraces. He got up from the ground. He washed and anointed himself, took a shower, cleaned up, shaved, changed his clothes, went into the house of the Lord, which would be a public thing to do, and worshiped. Then he went to his own house, and when requested, they set food before him, and he ate. David had been pleading with God for mercy, hoping that God might be diverted from the judgment, which sometimes happens. We hear in the Old Testament occasionally God does something different in response to pleas for mercy. But once it was final, once the child was dead, then David had to show publicly that he accepted it. No self-pity, no plunging into deeper despair, no going into the temple area in a hot rage, shaking his fist, how could you do this? It was my fault, I should have. No protesting, because David knew that the example he set at this point was one of recognizing that God's ways are perfect and that he was in no position to object. And so he goes to publicly send that message and to worship. One said it should be noted that on the one hand, the fact that misfortune falls is not in itself a proof of God's punishment or judgment, although that idea was quite commonly taken among the Jews, especially in Jesus' day. At the same time, it is obvious that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children. None of us lives to himself, none dies to himself. If one member suffers, all suffer with it. And in some ways, David is simply making it clear that he accepts that great truth in the way that God runs this universe. The servants of David still don't quite get it. What is this that you've done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, and then when he died, you arose and ate. And he said, well, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me and the child may live? They still don't quite get David's behavior. They think David is just feeling human grief, and he is. But he's feeling something more profound than that. He's feeling the grief of his own culpability in this. And that, in a sense, is what's driving him. And he's hoping that as he humbles himself before God, the child may be spared. It doesn't turn out to be the case. The fact that he prays for mercy is a reminder to us that God never owes mercy to anybody. You never exact grace from God. You never go into God's presence and say, I demand mercy and I demand it right now. It's not the way it works, Mercy is always voluntary on the part of the one giving it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be mercy. And we live by mercy day by day, and David understood that. He had no room to protest at what God decided to do, but nevertheless, he could hope for something else, which didn't turn out to be the case. David says, now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I'll go to him eventually, but he'll never return to me. So this visible sign of humility and remorse was driven by the premise that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. David was hoping for grace, but now that there's finality about it, the time of the fasting and prayer is over. Once a person's dead, there's no further place for prayer. We in our Protestant tradition have parted company with our Catholic friends over this and a variety of other points because, the Catholic tradition prays for the dead, believing that prayers for the dead can actually alter the circumstances of their present situation. We have believed rather that the Bible not only doesn't say that, but actually militates against it. It's appointed unto man to die once, and after that to face judgment. There is a kind of finality about it. Now is the day of salvation. Now is the time. Now is when we should be seeking to help each other to live better lives. But once death hinders the picture, it's the end of the story. And it does seem that in this case, that's exactly what David is assuming. So he's not going to go on in this time of remorse. He's going to simply get on with business. He says here, I shall go to him. That's commonly taken to mean I shall go to him eventually in my own death. And if so, it's one of those very few, somewhat scant references in the Old Testament to the notion of immortality. The New Testament is filled with kind of irrepressible enthusiasm. Death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? That's the New Testament posture. Old Testament death is viewed much more in a kind of dark way. And we don't have much reference like this, although there are a few that show up here and there. David consoled his wife Bathsheba, went to her, lay with her, she bore a son, and named him Solomon. He named him Solomon. The Lord loved him and sent a message by the prophet Nathan, so he named him Jedediah because of the Lord. This is much later. This is kind of running down the story, probably several years at this point. Solomon is the last child born to Bathsheba, the youngest son, and this is after Absalom is dead. Absalom is a name that means Abba, Father, Shalom, peace. Absalom, supposed to be the peace of his father, turned out to bring anything but peace. Absalom's gone, now a new son, Shalom, Solomon, enters the picture, a renewal of the hope of peace. This child was so conspicuously gifted, it became so clear that God had specially given this child talents that exceeded the ordinary, that it actually became a justification for passing over older sons and appointing Solomon to be the successor. Solomon, for that reason, got a nickname. The nickname is Jedediah. The name Jedediah means beloved by the Lord. And it was a way of suggesting that this is the one that was going to be the successor to David's rule. All right, verse 26, we go all the way back, you see, because we've gone several years down the road here, tracing the story of what took place. But of course, it all started when Rabbah was under siege. Joab had the city under siege. David was still in Jerusalem. The siege would last for months. We're not surprised David would stay home until the end of the siege. And so now we go back to that setting in which probably the incident with Bathsheba has happened, but the siege is still going on. David fought against Rabbah, the people of Ammon, and took the royal city. So returning to the original story, the royal city is probably, this is a variant in the Hebrew, the water fort. The bottom line means he was able to cut off the water supply. This particular city was susceptible to that kind of attack. Polybius, the Roman historian, mentions the same city being defeated in a similar siege hundreds of years later by a guy named Antiochus III during the intertestamental period. So this at least corroborates the susceptibility of the city to that kind of fall. I'm going to have to skip by this because time is getting by me rapidly, so I'm going to summarize this briefly. But basically, Joab doesn't want to get the credit for defeating the city. Now that the water is dried up, the people are going to have to cave quickly. So David comes. David is the one who is officially the victor in this city. He takes the crown on his head. It weighed about 100 pounds. It wasn't something you wore around the house very much, But nevertheless, he becomes the one who is credited with this victory by wearing that crown. He subjects the people to a rather brutal reprisals for picking this fight in the first place, and also subjects them, at least apparently, to some of what they did to their own children, involving offering them as burnt offerings, the brickworks that are referred to here. It's an interesting story. Sorry I haven't budgeted my time better, but I'm just skipping by this. Go back and read it if you want to get more detail on it. But anyway, that brings us to the end of the career of David, at least in terms of this whole incident, and we're going to be picking up next week with the story of Amnon and Tamar that we've alluded to earlier, so that's where it goes from here. All right, and that brings me in 60 seconds to the Sunday school lesson of the morning, so here we are. Number one, even as sins committed in secret must produce consequences, so righteous acts performed in secret are also seen by God and rewarded openly. This is the corollary to what I've been hammering away in this presentation. When we do bad things, there are consequences. You all know that. We all understand that really in many ways that's the principal thing this story is getting over to us. Kind of the unspoken flip side of it, however, is as we do the right thing, even very much in secret, the Father who sees secretly, openly rewards for it. Jesus, of course, makes that point. We try to commit sins in secret. Be sure your sins will find you out. We ought to do righteous acts in secret, anonymously as much as possible. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. But God, who sees in secret, has wired this same universe to bring about good effects as a result. So let's not lose sight of the other side of this story, which is a little bit more of an encouragement to us. Not only to avoid the wrong thing, but to do the right thing. While we may never embrace the philosophy, let us do evil that good may come, God is the great and wise ruler who can bring good even out of our evil acts. Had there been no Bathsheba, there would have been no Solomon, It's one of the strange, ironic twists of the story that one of the most glorious kings in the history of Israel ultimately came as a result of this bad act between David and Bathsheba. Some people would spin that to say, well, that's great. Let's just go out and, cut loose and do whatever, because God's always going to bring good out of it. That is not a wise strategy. We should avoid that. Paul had to deal with accusations that was what he was advocating because he beat the drum for grace so much. We are always responsible, but we should never believe that God is somehow unable, even out of the awful things we can sometimes do, to nevertheless accomplish good results. God causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. It's never an excuse for misdeeds on our part, but it is a great source of confidence and faith, even in our failings, to know that God is not put at loose ends, that God is not somehow twisting in the wind, beating, biting His nails, wondering what I'm going to do about this. Look at the mess they've made. Now I'm in trouble. God is never in that position. And this story certainly reminds us of that. The honesty of the Bible in treating its heroes stands as an encouragement that God uses very ordinary folks to accomplish extraordinary purposes. David was as human as the rest of us. Most of the folks that we run into in the Bible are very ordinary, very fallible, and yet we're astonished at how often God does good things, extraordinary things through quite ordinary people. And in this case, I think this lesson reminds us of that as well. Father, we're grateful for your lessons to us, lessons we really know, but need to be reminded of. We thank you for David. We thank you for that he's a man as frail and fallible as we are, that you used him in mighty ways, and yet you didn't cover up the blemishes. And in all of that, we, of course, can gain great encouragement, instruction, rebuke, comfort. We give you thanks for it. Ask your blessing on us now as we go our various ways. We pray that in all of this, Christ would be honored in our lives as we point people to Him. And for that, we give you thanks in His name. Amen.